All right, so are you ready to dive into one of the most well-known passages in the Bible?
I am. I think it's going to be fascinating.
Psalm 23. You know,
Yes.
the Lord is my shepherd. We've all heard it. We've probably heard it at a funeral or two.
Right.
But you sent in some commentaries and analyses that suggest there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think what's so fascinating about Psalm 23 is that while we often associate it with death, it's actually more about living, and specifically how we live in relationship with God, especially when things get tough.
Okay, so that whole shepherd metaphor, right? God as the shepherd guiding and protecting us like we're sheep. But I was reading that shepherd was also like a royal metaphor in the ancient Near East.
It was.
So what does that add to our understanding?
Well, it adds a whole other layer to it, doesn't it? Because when David calls God his shepherd, he's not just talking about gentle guidance. He's also acknowledging God's authority and submitting to his will. You know, it's like saying, God, you're the king, and I'm choosing to follow your lead.
And he's not saying the Lord is the shepherd. He's saying the Lord is my shepherd. Right.
That feels really personal.
It is. That's what makes this psalm so powerful. You know, it speaks to the idea of a personal God who is deeply involved in our lives, not some distant deity who's off, running the universe and doesn't have time for us. He cares for each of us individually, just like a shepherd tends to each sheep in their flock.
That brings us to that line, I shall not want.
Yes.
Is that just about material needs?
Yes.
Like having food and shelter?
Well, it certainly includes those basic necessities, but I think it goes even deeper. You know, when we look at verse 5 where it says, my cup overflows, there's a sense of extravagant abundance there. You know, David is painting a picture of a lavish feast.
Oh, wow.
Like a host who goes above and beyond to make sure his guests have everything they could possibly want.
So it's more than having enough. It's about being satisfied.
Exactly. And that satisfaction isn't just about physical things.
Yeah.
You know, it's about having our deepest longings and desires fulfilled by God. It's a spiritual abundance that flows from knowing that we're loved and cared for and provided for by the creator of the universe. Okay, but it's not just about sitting back and letting God take care of everything, right? Because the psalm also talks about guidance.
Right.
About following God's lead. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake.
Yeah, you're hitting on a crucial point there. Those paths of righteousness, those aren't just physical paths. You know, they're about choosing to live in a way that aligns with God's will.
Okay.
It's about making decisions that reflect his character and his values.
So paths of righteousness is more than just being a good person.
It is. It's about actively seeking to follow God's moral compass.
Okay, and then there's that phrase for his name's sake.
Right.
I've always kind of stumbled over that.
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. You know, that phrase suggests that God's actions are motivated by his own nature and character. He wants to show the world who he is through how he leads and cares for his people. You know, his goodness, his faithfulness, his justice. Like he's saying, I'm going to do right by you, not just because you're my sheep, but because that's who I am as God.
So it's not just about us, it's about God's reputation too.
It is. It's about his desire to reveal his character through how he cares for us.
So we've got this God who is both powerful and personal, who provides for us and guides us, and it's all about him revealing his character.
Exactly. And that leads us to one of the most powerful and well-known images in the Psalm. The valley of the shadow of death.
Yeah. What comes to mind when you hear those words?
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, it makes me think of funerals, right?
Yeah.
It seems like the go-to reading when somebody passes away.
Yeah.
But is that all it's about?
Right. Is it just about death?
It's certainly a comfort to people who are facing death, but Matthew Henry, in his commentary on the Psalms, points out that this speaks to any experience of darkness and fear. You know, we all face valleys in life, times of loss or grief, uncertainty, challenge.
I like that. Makes it more relatable.
Yes. It's not just about dying. It's about going through those tough times that we all go through at some point.
And he says he's walking through it,
Yes.
not running away from it, or even being carried over it. He's walking through the valley of the shadow of death.
You're picking up on something really important there. You know, there's no panic or avoidance in those words, just a steady forward movement, even though he's in darkness and confidence that he will emerge on the other side.
And he says valley of the shadow of death.
Right.
So a shadow isn't the thing itself.
Exactly. It's just a representation of it, almost like a watered down version of death. And remember, it's a valley, which might be deep and dark, but valleys can also be very fertile places. So it implies that there's a potential for growth and renewal, even in the midst of hardship.
I love that image. It's like wildflowers that pop up,
Yeah.
through the cracks in a sidewalk. So we've got this picture of us walking through this difficult time with God. And then in verse 4, he talks about finding comfort in God's presence, but also his rod and his staff.
Yes.
What are we to make of those?
Well, that's where we get into some really fascinating interpretations.
Yep.
Some commentators believe that the rod and the staff are two separate instruments.
Okay.
The rod symbolizing God's discipline and correction,
Okay.
while the staff represents his guidance and support.
Like a shepherd would use a staff to guide the sheep back to the path and a rod while things got out of hand.
Exactly. But other commentators see the rod and staff as a single instrument with multiple uses.
Yeah.
Both for guiding and for correcting.
So whether it's two tools or one tool, the point is that God is actively involved
Yes.
in guiding us, protecting us, and sometimes correcting us.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that even God's correction can be a comfort, because it shows that he's not just watching from a distance, but he's actively involved in shaping and directing our lives, towards righteousness.
It's like that saying, whom the Lord loves, he disciplines.
Right. It's not always easy to accept, God's discipline, but ultimately it is a sign of his love and care for us.
It's true. And that leads perfectly into this next image. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies.
Yes.
How can you have peace and abundance when you're surrounded by people who want to take you down?
Well, it's such a powerful image, isn't it? It's like God saying, I got your back, even when you're surrounded by hostility. And Spurgeon, in his commentary, he compares it to a soldier calmly enjoying a feast, completely undisturbed by the enemies that are banging on the door outside.
So bring on the enemies, I'm feasting with the king.
Yes. And it reminds us that God's blessings aren't dependent on our circumstances.
Yeah.
We can experience his peace and his provision even when we're facing challenges and opposition. He's not promising to eliminate our enemies, but he is promising to be our strength and to provide for us even when we're in the battle.
So it's not freedom from enemies, it's freedom in the midst of the enemies.
It is. It's a reminder that God doesn't always remove the difficulties, but he gives us what we need to overcome them.
I'm seeing this song in a whole new way. Okay, last but not least, we have these beautiful lines. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Yes.
What does that mean, to dwell in the house of the Lord?
Right. Well, I think that encompasses both an earthly and an eternal dwelling.
Okay.
It's about being in God's presence, experiencing his love and care, and enjoying fellowship with him both now and forever.
So it's not just about going to heaven when we die, it's about that relationship that we have with him here.
Right.
Yeah.
It's about experiencing that deep, abiding connection with him that brings true satisfaction and fulfillment.
And it says goodness and mercy will follow him.
Yes.
As if they're pursuing him.
It is a beautiful image, isn't it? Almost like, a parent chasing after a toddler who's running off in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
God's love and grace are always there pursuing us, beckoning us to come closer.
And Spurgeon describes this idea of an eternal dwelling as moving to the upper story of God's house.
Yeah, I love that.
It's like we're already in God's house.
Yeah.
So we get to move to the penthouse suite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like we're already dwelling with God here on earth, but in heaven, we simply move to a higher, more glorious level of that same dwelling.
Well, I feel like we've only scratched the surface, but I'm seeing Psalm 23 in a whole new light.
Me too. It's amazing how much depth and richness there is to uncover when we really start to dig in. And I think in our next segment, we could start to explore some of the practical implications of all.
Oh, okay. I like that. I'm ready to go deeper.
How does this understanding of God as our shepherd shape how we live our lives in the here and now?
Ooh, that is a great question. I can't wait.
Me too.
My mind is officially blown. I never realized how much was packed into those few verses.
It's amazing, isn't it, how these ancient scriptures can still speak to us today?
Yeah, and one thing that struck me was that it's not just a personal reflection. It's David's personal experience, but it also speaks to the whole nation of Israel.
Yeah, you're right. It did resonate with the collective experience of Israel.
How so?
Well, if you think back through the Old Testament, you'll see that God's shepherding is frequently connected with key moments in Israel's history, like the Exodus from Egypt or the exile in Babylon.
Oh yeah, like wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Talk about needing a shepherd.
Exactly. Psalm 77, for example, talks about God leading them through the wilderness like a flock. And in Isaiah 40, the prophet uses that shepherd imagery to offer hope to the Israelites who were in exile in Babylon, promising that God would gather them up and lead them back to their land.
So even though David is writing, from his personal experience, he's also tapping into that larger story of God's faithfulness to his people.
Exactly. And that makes it even more powerful because it reminds us that you and I are part of a much bigger story.
Right.
A story of God's love and redemption that spans generations. A story that started long before us and will continue long after we're gone.
And that story continues into the New Testament.
It does.
Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd.
He does in John's Gospel.
Right.
Yeah.
And then in 1 Peter, he's called the shepherd and guardian of our souls.
You got it.
So it's almost like Psalm 23 is this prophecy that points forward to Jesus.
It's beautiful how you put that. It's like David is giving us this glimpse of what perfect shepherding looks like.
Right.
And then Jesus comes along and he embodies it fully. He guides us, he protects us, he provides for us, and ultimately he lays down his life for us.
Which is why it makes sense that we read it at funerals.
It does.
But it's not just a funeral psalm.
It's not. It's a psalm for life, for every stage of our journey.
Right. We can get so focused on, those verses about death that we kind of miss the bigger picture.
You're so right. It's about learning to trust God in the good times and the bad. Finding rest in his presence, allowing him to lead us in those paths of righteousness, and ultimately enjoying the abundance of his blessings.
Both now and in the future.
Yes.
And it all comes back to that personal relationship, right? That's what makes this psalm so powerful.
Wow.
David claims God as his shepherd.
You've hit the nail on the head. And you know what I find fascinating?
What's that?
In many ancient cultures, the idea of a personal God was usually associated with lesser deities, not with the supreme God.
Oh, wait.
But in Psalm 23, David is saying that the God of the universe, the creator of all things, is also his personal shepherd. He's intimately involved in his life.
Whoa, that changes things. It's like saying the CEO of a Fortune 500 company is my personal life coach.
Exactly. And it completely transforms our understanding of who God is and how he relates to us. He's not some distant, impersonal force.
Right.
But a loving father who wants to be involved in every detail of our lives.
I love that image. Way more inviting than, the stern judge who's waiting for us to mess up.
Right. And it makes those paths of righteousness seem less like a set of rules to follow and more like an invitation to walk alongside the one who loves us most.
And it's not just about receiving those blessings passively, right? It's about actively following him.
You got it.
Yeah.
It's about being active participants in the relationship.
Right.
Not just passive recipients of his grace. We're not just sheep passively grazing in a field. We're called to follow the shepherd.
Right.
To trust his guidance and to walk in his ways.
So how do we do that? What does that look like?
Well, that's where the paths of righteousness come into play.
Okay.
It's about aligning our lives with God's will, seeking to live in a way that honors and pleases him. It's about making choices that reflect his character and his values, even when those choices are difficult or unpopular.
So more than just being a good person, it's about being more like Jesus.
You're exactly right. And that's not always easy, is it?
Definitely not.
I mean, let's be honest, sometimes those paths of righteousness feel more like, uphill climbs than pleasant strolls beside still waters.
It's like, God, I thought you were taking me to green pastures, not this rocky, thorny path.
That's a great way to put it. But that's where we need to remember those other images from the psalm, the rod and the staff.
Right.
They remind us that God is there to guide us.
Right.
And to correct us when we stray and give us the strength we need to keep moving forward, even when the path is difficult.
So we don't avoid the tough stuff, we just go through it with him.
Exactly. We have a shepherd who is always with us, leading us, protecting us, and providing for us. He knows the terrain, he knows where the dangers are, and he's committed to getting us safely to the other side.
And that's what's so amazing about God's grace, right? He doesn't expect us to be perfect.
Right.
But he gives us what we need to keep growing.
Absolutely. It's a journey, not a destination. And as long as we keep our eyes fixed on the Good Shepherd, trusting in his guidance and relying on his strength, we can be confident that he will lead us to those green pastures and still waters.
In this life and the next.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this picture of God as our shepherd, guiding, protecting, providing, correcting. But how do we actually experience that in our everyday lives?
That is a great question. And I think it's one that we can explore more deeply in our next segment.
Okay.
We'll talk about some specific ways that we can cultivate that awareness of God's presence and allow him to shepherd our hearts in the midst of all of our everyday challenges and joys.
So we've spent some time unpacking Psalm 23, the imagery, the history, and how it points to Jesus as the Good Shepherd.
We have.
But now I'm wondering, how does this translate into real life? How do we experience God's shepherding, in our crazy, busy lives?
That's a great question. It's one thing to admire the beauty of this psalm, but it's another thing entirely to let those truths sink in and actually change how we live.
So how do we do that?
Well, I think a good starting point is to try to personalize the psalm.
Okay.
As you read it, replace the me with you. And really let those words seep into your soul.
So instead of the Lord is my shepherd, I would say the Lord is your shepherd.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when we do that, it becomes more than just a beautiful poem. It becomes a personal promise.
Okay.
An invitation to experience God's love and care in a tangible way.
So I'm taking ownership of those promises. It's not just David's experience, it's mine too.
Exactly. It's about making that personal connection with God, recognizing that he's not just a distant deity, but a loving shepherd who wants to guide and care for us individually.
So once we've personalized it, how do we actually live it out?
Well, let's go back to those images of green pastures and still waters. Where in your life do you need to experience God's rest and restoration?
Okay.
What are those places or those practices that bring you a sense of peace and renewal?
Sometimes I think it's being out in nature.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Going for a hike or sitting by a lake or listening to the birds sing.
Or sometimes it's just having quiet time with a cup of coffee before the craziness of the day starts.
Yes. Or it could be listening to music or reading a good book. It's really about being intentional, about creating that space for stillness and connection with God, whatever that looks like for you.
So we create space and trust that God will meet us there.
Right, because he's the one who leads us to those green pastures and still waters.
But we have to follow.
We do.
And then what about those paths of righteousness? How do we know which path he wants us to follow?
Yeah, well, that's where we need to lean into God's word and his spirit and, wise counsel from others. It's about listening to that still small voice. Discerning God's will for our lives.
Yeah.
And then having the courage to step out in faith, even when the path ahead seems uncertain.
And that's where the rod and staff come in, right?
Exactly.
He's guiding us and correcting us and strengthening us.
Yes, we don't have to navigate those paths alone.
We've got our shepherds.
We do.
Oh.
He's always with us, leading us, protecting us, providing for us.
And even in those dark valleys, when we're going through those hard times, we have to remember God is with us.
That's such an important truth to hold on to. No matter what we're facing, we can find that peace and strength in knowing that God is with us, that he's not going to abandon us in our time of need.
It's like he sets up that banquet table right there in the middle of the valley.
Yes.
And reminds us that even in the dark times, he's still providing for us.
That's beautiful. It's a reminder that God's blessings aren't dependent on our circumstances. He can provide for us and comfort us and strengthen us no matter what we're going through.
So we don't wait for the valley to disappear.
Right.
We recognize he's with us in the valley.
Exactly. It's about trusting that he's working everything together for our good, even when we can't see the bigger picture.
This has been amazing. I have such a new appreciation for Psalm 23. It's more than just a pretty poem. It's a guide for living a life of peace and abundance and purpose, knowing that we have a good shepherd who's always leading us home.
Beautifully said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final question to ponder.
Yeah.
What green pastures and still waters is God leading you to today? Where do you need to experience his restoration and his abundant provision?
That's a great question to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Psalm 23. Until next time, may you experience the fullness of God's shepherding care in every area of your life.